Hi, everybody. Happy Halloween. I hope you're doing okay. We'll start in a minute. If you can please download your assignments and notes for this week. I'll be right with you. Okay. So let's talk about what we have in store today. Today we are going to talk about attacks. I plan to demo a little bit of brute force, as I told you last week. So we're going to talk about different types of attacks. So if you can please open your notes and the assignments, we'll do that first. And then I have a presentation that I uploaded, which contains some pen testing and ethical hacking content. So we'll touch on that as well. Okay. Do we have any questions before we start? No questions. Okay, so I have everybody on mute. If you have questions, please open or unmute and ask. Share screen real quick. Okay, so in this week, we're going to talk about security attacks. And I combine some of the chapters from the Security Plus optional textbook to give you the overall. I also added some materials. So we'll start with talking about sniffing attack. And if you took the networking class, you've already seen how we can use Wireshark to analyze network traffic. But an attacker can use such tool to be able to capture the data over the network, especially public network. Okay. So when you're looking at a lot of different attacks, Usually the attacker would have to study or analyze the type of traffic that your network would have before they attempt. It's kind of like if somebody, a bank robber, before he robs the bank, he's have to study the blueprint of the bank. So I will talk about the processes on how to do that from an ethical hacking standpoint. So in the first question, it asks you, what is a sniffing attack? And it's a form of attack that utilizes scanners to determine your network traffic, protocols, and ports. If an attacker can identify the type of traffic that you have, the protocols and ports that you use, that will give him or her a better understanding on what's going on with your network. Then they will identify the weaknesses in your network and be able to use those weaknesses as target. So for the first question, we want to put down that sniffing attack is an attack that uses scanner to determine network traffic, protocols, and ports. And a lot of these tools is going to give you that. Okay. You can also find the answer on page 1 of your notes. So the tools that we see, that's often see in the sniffing attack, you often see Wireshark. There are additional tools that could be used. Some are better than others, like Kismet, TCP dump. Today I'm going to use Kane so I can show you some of the features that Kane offers. Now, from a network defender standpoint, an administrator or a security specialist, you can use some of these tools to really identify some of the areas in your network that you can improve. And sometimes companies would hire a contractor, external entity to come in and assess your network. Okay. So these are some of the tools that you often see in use. Now, Kismet is used for Apple-based systems, and Kismet is used for PC and Linux-based systems. So some of them uses terminal, which is command line, and then some of them would have user interface like Wireshark. And so an attacker would study the type of traffic that you have on the network. And internally, we want to also assess our own network and be able to determine what we need to secure or do a better job in security in some sense. Last week, we touched a little bit on denial of service and distributed denial of service. And the purpose in this form of attack is to disrupt services, web servers, right? Your DNS servers, different type of centralized system that service the company for operation. Distributed would use multiple systems to attack a single target, whereas denial of service would be a single source attacking a single target. So in question 2, it asks you to identify 2 applications that's used in the sniffing the network. And you can pick any of the 2 listed, that will be fine. There are other applications that you see, commercialized applications. Some are free, which is open source, and some are commercialized. For example, Wireshark is open source, right? So I put down Wireshark because it's a very common tool. And then I put down EtherCat. Okay, so you can pick any 2 from the list. You can put that on number 2. And as we just mentioned about DOS and DDoS, so DOS, one attacker against one target. distributed denial of service attack from 2 or more systems against a single target. And we mentioned last week that they can use other computers that's connected to the internet and be able to launch attack from different systems. As people are not aware and they click on the link, right, that can download the script, it would take over the system, making it a zombie system, and be able to go against a single target. So in the attack, somebody can spoof or change the system identity. And we know that it comes back to 2 areas, IP address and MAC address, okay? So in order to get away with the attempts, they would look for ways to spoof IP address or MAC addresses, and we'll talk about spoofing shortly. And then you also see some form of poisoning attack. And when they want to launch this form of attack, they would study the protocols, and sometimes that would come from network capture, things that you could get from Wireshark, looking at protocols that store data, like for DNS records, how that's stored in memory or cache memory for temporary access, and then they would corrupt those files, okay? They can change it to a different type of data, or they simply destroy the file. So that way that service is poisoned or disrupted. So poisoning is common in different type, and you would see some attacks would incorporate other forms of attacks. So in security, we have to really look at the layered approach on how to prevent different forms of attack. So we touch on DDoS and DOS now, and its purpose, right? To prevent users from accessing services on a certain system, servers, right? Or it could be a laptop that the CEO uses. So it could be any type of system in the network. So as they transition to some of the steps in the attack, usually the attacker would need to gain higher privileges as administrator or root user. And with that, sometimes that can be done through weaknesses in a system or weaknesses in the network. Because if we don't have proper control and rules set up for group membership, user accounts, authentication, what we will see is that a user, external user, unauthorized user, can gain higher privileges and be able to access different resources within the network. Okay, so escalation of privileges is very common. Okay, and that is a technique that they would use to be able to access different areas of the system or the network. Then I touch a little bit on spoofing. Spoofing is really a way to impersonate or masquerade as another system or someone else. Take on another system identity. So in a MAC address spoofing, they would use software methods, code, script, tools that they find or write to overwhelm the switch, which deals with the MAC address table. And they would flood that table so that way it's not containing relevant MAC address information. That way they will bypass the filtering with the MAC because on the firewall, which could be an appliance or software, if you use Windows firewall, right, you can set up certain type of filtering. Most companies would use an actual hardware, an appliance, and they would MAC filter all the system that either is allowed or disallowed inside that network. And at the switch level, the switch is an appliance. Its job is to switch packets back and forth internally inside the network. So if someone floods the table on the switch, they would be able to bypass the filtering because it's not able to store all the accurate MAC addresses that's inside that network. In the IP spoofing, this is when we get to the router. And as you probably have read and heard also from the last class, IP is used to route, right, from one network to another network. And sometimes you would have internal systems that would route from one subnet to another subnet, so that way we can separate subsection of the network. So what they can do is they can spoof the IP, change the source address, so that way we don't know which system that's generating that traffic or attack traffic. So it would look like a packet that's coming from a different source, somebody inside. It's kind of like how I show up to a company and I would wear a mask that looks like an employee. And so that way I can go undetected inside that company. And that's the same technique. So when they launch the attack, it appears that they're using the address from that organization. Now, as I mentioned before, if you heard this in the last class, when someone spoofed the IP, they have to make sure that it's bypassing each and every single point. So if we have a lot of the detection system built in to really assess and monitor the traffic, a lot of the time they have to be able to spoof to be able to bypass these systems, each and every single one. So when you have a single point security measure, if you only have one firewall, right, they can flood the firewall or they can take down the firewall, and then it's all game, it's open. If you don't have internal intrusion prevention system or intrusion detection system, what will happen is they can bypass one time and they would be inside the network undetected. So therefore, we would implement monitoring systems and system that would block, right? And we want to make sure that all of these solutions in security is overlapping. Now, so for the next question, for number 4, you don't have to write down everything. The two main types for number 4 is MAC address spoofing and IP address spoofing. And I simply just restate the notes material. Okay. Now, there are some tools, right? Some operating system like Kali, it would have many of the different areas in pen testing incorporated. So that way people don't have to go and download the tools to be able to do their job. And Kali Linux is an operating system that's often used to practice or use at the intro level for security assessment if we're looking at, penetration testing. Okay, any question? Okay, so For number 4, we know that there are 2 types of spoofing. Then we can go further and talk about different forms of attack. And the 2 types of spoofing, you can find that also on page 1 of your notes. So SYN flood attack is used against servers on the internet, especially web servers. And it's easy to launch and it's difficult to stop. Because as you know, when you access a website, right, there gotta be some kind of acknowledgement and synchronization, and SYN stand for synchronization. So the server has to send that type of acknowledgement back and say, hey, I'm ready to serve this page to this particular destination. And at some point, right, the system would be synchronized. So what they would do is they know that this is the type of traffic that's happening over the internet. So what they can do is they would launch, right, lots of requests, so that way the server would continuously have to reply and synchronize. And it is a form of distributed denial of service or denial of service. It basically disrupts the handshaking process. So that way, none of the regular client system can actually access that server. So when you're looking at the attack map that I showed you from last week, a lot of this is going to be SYN flood and distributed denial of service. That's why when you look at the category and the rates, the protocols that's being used, you often see it's coming back to TCP handshake. Okay. Any question? Okay. So that gives you a little bit of the summary and the process. If you wanted to read a little bit further on how the acknowledgement and synchronization happens between the server and the client system, right? So every time you visit like youtube.com or a website, all of this is happening in the back. And so let's say that an attacker is trying to attack YouTube, they would need to study the traffic and be able to flood the synchronization step, which prevent other users, other people from accessing YouTube. Okay, so on page 2, it talks about the steps for the SYN flood attack. Now, with the web, there's also a lot of man-in-the-middle attack. And this can be target an individual or an organization. So let's take an individual. Let's say that I log into my bank and I'm processing a huge transfer from one bank to another bank. So in order to get the funds to transfer to their own account, the attackers would need to intercept my traffic by listening into what my system is sending. So they would need to scan my traffic, they need to scan my session. So when I authenticate to my bank, it's established a secure session. And when the communication is established, the bank servers would respond back to my system, right? And it's serving the information. So the point in man in the middle is they want to intercept traffic. They want to tell the bank that they are me legitimately. So they need to see what I'm generating and tell the bank system that don't send it back to the source, right? They would impersonate my system and receive the information. Now, this And when it's used with the organization, usually they would use it to capture data, right? Like important design, you know, a lot of the properties that come back to the company. Let's say that NASA has a special design or blueprint of, I don't know, satellite or spaceship, and a scientist is sending this back and forth to another group of scientists, right? They can use man in the middle to be able to intercept that traffic and then impersonate the scientist system to be able to acquire that blueprint of the satellite or the spaceship. So they would also inject code if you're looking at database that's being used, like for online purchasing, banking, health records, stuff like that. What they can do is once they get that into that session, they can inject code, right, to be able to do cross-site scripting and obtain specific password, specific record information, social security, account number, etc. Because the database would contain the record that have those things. Not identification of the user, and also, you know, it could relate to bank account, it could relate to, you know, retirement funds, etc. So it could be a vast amount of things, but you often would see man-in-the-middle attack being used with other forms of attack. That's common. So in the database sense, or that case, you would see man-in-the-middle being used with cross-site scripting. Okay. And also SQL injection, because if the database is using SQL, then they would use SQL injection. Okay, so you often see the acronym MITM, that would be man-in-the-middle attack. Now, Kerberos is a cryptography tool that Microsoft implemented because, you know, the majority of organizations use Microsoft. So Kerberos, if you enable this cryptography in servers and client system, it helps prevent man-in-the-middle in such that there's mutual authentication, and it disallows the malicious system to insert during that session. Okay, so far this has been working for us, but nothing is 100% secure. Okay, next we're going to talk about some poisoning. So ARP stands for Address Resolution Protocol. It's a way that we can resolve IP to MAC and MAC to IP. Now at the switch level and the routing level, switch uses MAC address, which is physical to your network interface card. If you're using a Wi-Fi, if you're using, you know, an Ethernet adapter that connects a cable to the switch. So ARP poisoning really entails misleading that address for the system, resolving it to store the result in the cache. So when it resolved, it stored that information into memory. And what it will do is it would utilize that information to be able to resolve that same system continuously. So at the switch level or at the computer level, what they can do is they can change that stored ARP information. And that's what we call ARP poisoning. Okay, so with this, it gives you the step on how that happens. So when the packets gets to the destination network, it would use a MAC to get to the computer system, and it passes that through the switch. So there gotta be a request and a reply component, so that way the computer with the IP address, it would know that IP address would mean this MAC address would be equal to this MAC address. So all OSs would hear ARP reply, so it would store that as a MAC address information. So what they can do is they would use script to create fake ARP reply packets, and it would use a fake MAC address to poison the information that's stored in the cache. Okay, so you often see ARP poisoning being used with man in the middle and denial of service. And that way, after they poison the ARP, they can redirect that packet, right, using code insertion to a different router to their own system. So this is why they want to eavesdrop or listen into the traffic, right? They can completely hijack that session after they use ARP poisoning. Okay, question. So we will hear a lot of new terminology today. If you have questions on specific ones, please let me know. Okay. So this gives you a little bit of information about ARP using ARP poisoning with denial of service. And in this case, it's using it with the default gateway. Okay. Now, every single network on the internet has a DNS, domain name system, and that ties to a lot of these web servers. Okay. So for example, Microsoft.com, Google.com, right? DNS allows us to resolve the URL to the IP address. So how the system resolve it is it has a record once that role is installed and enabled on the network to reference what that domain name is to which IP address. And the reverse lookup, what that does is it look up the IP address to the domain name, the fully qualified domain name. So what the attacker would do is they would spoof the system identity and using a different name, and then change the record by poisoning it. So that would lead you to the DNS poison. So all they're doing is they're modifying or corrupt the DNS records. And so that way, the IP that was being replaced is not a legitimate IP. Okay, or the URL that they replaced, that's going to go to their domain. And so that way the user would connect to the wrong domain. Okay. Now, many of the server operating systems, right, include Microsoft was the one that implemented this for their operating servers, server operating systems, but in other cases, you would also see the security side of the DNS. So in your lab this week, you're going to actually work on an exercise that's implementing the DNSSEC. So what they did was they created an extension to that protocol to protect its records and prevent it from being changed. So they implement the integrity control so that way the DNS records cannot be modified. Okay, so to reduce the risk of the DNS poisoning, ask the administrator. What you can do is you can enable or implement DNSSEC. Okay. Another form of attack is your farming attack, and this relates to the DNS because it manipulates the DNS name resolution process. It corrupts the DNS server or the client, redirect. So after they do DNS poisoning, usually they would do the farming attack, where it would redirect the user, right, or all the users in that domain to a different domain or a malicious domain. Okay, so instead of going to Microsoft.com, they can redirect it to their own domain. Okay, any question? Okay, and then this gives you the scenario on how they would use distributed denial of service with the DNS attack. Okay, so usually now we started to see a lot more attack on the Internet of Things, right? Like smartwatches, health systems that connect to the internet, camera systems, smart TV. And with the IoT, there are different form of malware that they use. One of the common one is called Morai. And what it does is it took over many of these IoT systems and make them become bots on the botnets. And then they would use it to launch distributed denial of services. So instead of using the computer, they just use smaller computing systems. Okay, because now we have refrigerator, microwave, things that connects to the internet automatically, right? So what you see is you see IoT systems being targeted. Okay, and as we scale out to different type of system being used in the network, we have to be aware of what type of attacks that could be launched. Okay, any questions with farming DNS attacks? All right. You probably heard of a lot of these cases, you just didn't know the proper name maybe, right? So when you read a security incident, usually they would tie back, a lot of the times you're gonna see it's DDoS or, it's man in the middle. That's very common, especially when we look at the internet and all the networks that's connecting together. And another term that we also need to know is amplification of attack. So the amplification of attack just means that it's a way that they can increase the traffic being sent. So instead of sending like a flood of 5,000 requests, they can amplify it, right? Using script with 10,000, 50,000, a million packets sent. And ultimately what that does is it causes disruption because the servers get so busy that it cannot respond to that many requests, or the appliances would get so busy that it cannot pass all of that traffic. So it cripple the network systems ultimately. Okay, so here's an example. This is a Smurf where it spoofed the source address, who is it that's coming from, and direct the broadcast ping packet. So Smurf been done since the early 90s or even before that. I call it ping of death, right? So ping is a command that's used across all types of network. Administrators and support people use it to detect if systems are connected. But there's a way that we can ping the system continuously for so many times. So what they will do is they would broadcast that ping to many systems many times. Okay. And here it talks about the protocol that ping uses. So when you issue a ping command in command line, it has to send requests to the destination, and it would repeatedly. For Microsoft, they generate 4 packets. Okay. Now in Linux and Apple-based system, which is Unix developed originally, right? They transition and change. But with those type of system, you can actually specify the ping count, and then you can have it repeatedly keep pinging. So every time that it sends a request, right, it's gonna look for a reply. So you should receive a response. And with Microsoft is if it sends 4 and it's not receiving anything, it times out. But in other type of system, it would just continue to send until you tell it to stop. So really ping is a unicast, it's 1-to-1. But what they can do is they can change that to make it 1-to-many, multicast or broadcast. Okay, where you would ping and you can ping many systems at once and many times. So that will be Smurf. Okay, any questions? Okay, so if you took networking classes, you probably heard of network time protocol. This is a protocol that allows the server to update time on the systems to sync time. And you use it all the time. So we're about to have the time change, right? We roll back an hour in the fall. So all your service provider like T-Mobile, Verizon, Spectrum, AT&T, all of these service provider, they have this implementation on their network. So when they update the server time, it automatically syncs with your smartphone, with your own network, which is part of their service, right? So amplification of attack can be used on NTP. What they do is they create a list, it's called a monolith command that can generate it to many hosts, not just one. And they would spoof the source IP because they don't want for the systems to recognize who they are when they're sending that command to flood a target. Okay, so you do see that being impacted with the NTP servers. So when I taught security years ago, you rarely see this form of attack, and it's transitioned quite a bit in security. That the protocols, they were written and created long ago, right? From 1970, some are more recent, but with that, these protocols have weaknesses. So, if they understand how the protocol works, they can use it to their own advantage. And the only way that we can do is we can expect those type of attack and be able to combat it with preventative measures. Okay, do you have any questions? Okay, so let me check out some of the questions here before I do a demo for you. For number 5, it asks you, how can you prevent or reduce the possibility of SYN-ACK attacks? First thing first, detection. Monitor network traffic, very important. Most server operating systems would have network monitoring tools built in. and not just to turn it on, but to do analysis with it. That has to be done regularly. Now, last week we talked about compliance. Most of the compliance body to meet the regulated entity requirements like HIPAA and, SOX, so those compliance body would require the company to show that they are implementing some kind of monitoring system and analyzing it at least once a year. But, realistically, professionally, if we are a good security professional, we want to monitor this and regularly analyze it. Okay. That's why network administrator and, IT analyst, that's what they're for. Okay. So the network analyst and the administrator, they work together to really look at, right, how they can make sure that the network is available, but at the same time, we want to work towards security. We can set firewall rules to block the traffic, the SYN flood traffic. So some firewall are better than other. So you can set up the rules and then, and a lot of the newer appliances, they're very intuitive, right? And it so it generates a pattern of your network. And then it uses the rule that you set to really, adjust based on some pattern. Now you can look at firewall that can go from a few $100s for a very small network all the way to $10, $20, $30,000 or more. So security appliances are very expensive. It depends on the feature that could be incorporated. And then some firewall have live engineer that can help you, right? They supply some of the services where live engineer can also edit and change the firewall components to make sure that you can better protect your network. Implement virtual private network. So VPN should be used for external connections that require sensitive or that has sensitive data. That's very important. Okay. So these three areas are a must. That's why I highlighted them. And then these three are also important, but it's more on how we're looking at the users and also to better protect our network with the other areas. So restrict the user access with least privilege, because they can keylog somebody that has very high privilege and be able to get in that way, right? So least privilege means that they only need certain amount of actions to be able to do their job, not more than what they needed, okay? And many companies fail in this area because, they tend to have people doing multiple tasks in different roles. So they're overlapping a lot of the user privileges control to cut costs, but eventually it costs them more money when they lose the security measures in their network. Then to classify the data, and that comes back to permission for data access. And when we look at data classification, just to give you an overall thing, you can have a security specialist that just focuses on that, really, because it's very large. You have data in motion, things that are coming in and out of your network, like email, web data transfer, and then data at rest, which is the files that are stored and archived inside your storage servers. And so we can drill down on how the access to those systems to be able to access the data and be able to better protect. So if for data in motion, we can think about how we can use cryptography like email encryption, right? Secure protocol that has encryption, or like VPN traffic, and VPN protections to protect your traffic and isolate that type of traffic from the rest of your network. And then ultimately, everybody should have a data backup, some form of backup server, because, you know, it's not a matter of if it's going to happen, it's a matter of when it's going to happen. Attack happens. So they have to make sure that they're aware of it and protect it. Okay. So any question with number 5?
Oh, I have a question, but not with number 5.
Okay.
Okay, so I have VPN on my network, and I was using two-step verification for my email, and I forgot my password got messed up, so I didn't know what my password was for a Microsoft account,
Okay.
and so I had to have the code sent to a backup email.
Okay.
I got disconnected from my internet, and then when I reconnected to the internet, it said I had tried the verification code too many times when I didn't. So I'm wondering what kind of attack that might have been, since I didn't even get a chance to enter the verification code.
So if it was a form of attack, that would be a man in the middle and a session hijack. So it basically, it's also farming, right? But not to the DNS, to your system.
How could they do that if I VPN?
VPN doesn't, if you use OpenVPN, right? OpenVPN just goes to, so okay.
I
A
use
lot
Norton.
of people think that VPN is, my headphones stopped working. A lot of people think that VPN is completely secure. It's just, okay, so it's only secure to somebody that's external. Okay, keep that in mind. So if somebody is in that same network, because it's virtual private network, and virtual private network can use many type of services. Could be peer-to-peer environment where you connect to a system that connects to another system. It could be, if you're using IPsec, that would be a different type of protocol. It would establish the tunnel where it would seal that traffic to people who are trying to eavesdrop. But it doesn't mean that they're not already in your system. If they're already in your network, or if they're already in your system, then they could see and hear everything. So the question would come back to, how secure is that particular client? Because when you are connecting to a VPN, and if your system is already infected, they could see and hear everything you do.
I mean, like a backdoor?
Yes. Or it could be that something that, was downloaded and installed, and they could sense, they could eavesdrop everything that you do. So that would be easier than just, going through multiple steps to impersonate you during the VPN session. Because it's a lot easier to social engineer the user to get inside that user system versus trying to listen into the traffic and intercept that traffic in general. Now, so it's really depending on their goal. So when that happens, and it could possibly be their server fault, that sometimes there's a delay when you submit that password reset requirement, and then you have a disruption in the internet, and during that time, possibly that their server is receiving the request continuously somehow, and it just track it as if you had, it times out, right? Like you requested so many times, they put it where it would lock 24 hours, or there could be other security implementation that they have. So what you should think about, and you know, just to better protect yourself is to think about what's already in your system and can some of your security tool detect that. If you're using something that goes undetected, then possibly think about other tools that might be able to detect that. But like I said before, there are a lot of things that we don't know in the wild, right? Like, you know, different malware is born every day, different script is written every day. What I would suggest also is to contact the company and inform them of an incident. They can see it more visibly than you, even if you're coming from VPN, because on the server, when it generates so many times in that request, it would see who that's generating, right? And then where's that traffic coming from? And you know, so when it sends you that email, because all of these requests has been generated, they would be able to visibly see that. So
Wait,
I would,
I'm
yes.
sorry, my question is, can a hacker brute force that
Oh
verification
yeah.
code? Oh,
Mhm.
they can.
Yep. So a lot of times they use multi-factor, which is, you know, a password with a code with your smartphones or a device that you have. But multi-factor is only elevating the security. It doesn't fully protect. Okay. So because ultimately an email is what you have, right? So there in authentication, just to sidetrack real quick to answer completely your question, in security, we look at authentication as number one, we identify the user. Number two, we authenticate the user. When you authenticate the user, you have to use multi-method. Something you know, which is usually your password, your PIN. Something you are, which is biometrics, biological characteristics. Something you have, which is usually, you know, like smart card. Now, since we're doing a lot of things remotely, like email, smartphones, like they would send you a text. But if that system is infected in the first place, right? Like if you're getting key log, when you type in that verification code, they get that log. Okay. Or if they're able to see your email, if your email is hacked, they got your verification code. So it doesn't mean that multi-factor would give us complete security. And that's why a lot of the CIO journals and articles and, you know, the CIOs, they discuss this all the time. It's probably more convenient to use those type of format, but it's never 100% safe. So I would contact the company and let them know what happened. And also if you want, you should talk to your service provider, because they scan, they monitor everything. They see that too. You can ask for, you know, that window in time and see. Um, Sometimes they would refuse because it requires them to go and pull that information. But um, when it's court related or it's criminal, you know, like cyber crime related, they will, you know, you have to submit a court order and then it will take them time to go back. They archive a lot of these, you know, traffic and all of these things. By law, they have to. Okay. So that would be my suggestion.
Thank you.
Mhm. Okay. So for number 6, what is used to prevent man-in-the-middle attack? Kerberos. Okay. Cryptography for authenticated sessions. And this one using PKI. So just real quick, I think in the future week, I'll talk a little bit more about this, but think of PKI as in you would have 2 different keys to enter your home. Okay, so instead of using one key for all the doors, right, like to your house, front door, back door, etc., you would have a private and a public key. And we would use one key to lock and one key to open. Okay, so there and now you know, my security students, they always say, well, you know, cryptography seems like it's a solution for most. Well, that's not always the case, right? Cryptography is good, but it requires a lot of the resources. Um, it it would, that's okay, Sarah. It would, you know, take up,
I'm
yes.
sorry. My student says my screen is real small. Is there something we did last week to make myself look bigger, either spotlighting or pinning or something?
Yeah, let me see if I can spotlight. Okay, is that better now? I added the spotlight for you.
Okay, he's writing right now, but I'll ask him. Thank you.
Okay, so you know, so the solution for this is to use authentication cryptography, either Kerberos, or if you're looking at authentication to the web, right, we would utilize other type of cryptography like RSA. Now, some cryptography are better than others, as you know, and it comes back to the key, right? Because in a lot of cases, they don't reverse engineer that cryptography, right? Trying to crack it or trying to you know, so the whole point in eavesdropping and you know, hijacking the session is to trying to capture that key. So let's think about it, right? Like if somebody wants to enter your house to steal things, they don't just they don't want to just try to break down your door, right? Or break the lock. They're gonna try to steal your keys. And so that way it's easier to get in. So, you know, depending on the implementation, the use, the knowledge in cryptography. So we would say cryptography is adequate solution for many things, but it also can create bottleneck and a lot of different areas for operation. So we have to think about the availability, because cryptography would address confidentiality and integrity. Okay, so now for 7, we already talked about ARP poisoning. And this is the type of attack that can derive from ARP is man in the middle and denial of service. Okay. The type of attack that's launched against DNS services for number 8, that would be DNS poisoning, farming, distributed denial of service against DNS. Okay. Any question from 6 through 8? Okay, so while you put that down, any questions? So I want to kind of preview a little bit on password attacks. So that way when you watch the demo, you would say, oh, okay, what that is. So password attacks basically is a way that someone can discover your password or bypass the password using for that system or that network. And it can be in 2 areas. As you know, that all the password for accounts, now there's requirement for cryptography implementation. So you're in your regular operating system, when you create a user account and your password, it's encrypted your password as its store. Back in the day, like in Windows 98, right, password was stored in plain text. And Microsoft has improved this over time. However, it doesn't always, it doesn't mean that someone cannot brute force it or they cannot discover your password. So an easiest way to get someone's password is to use a keylogger, right? But let's say that a system that doesn't really get internet and it's not downloaded, right? Then they have to find a way to brute force it. So brute force is try and true, meaning that it would try to guess all the possible combination by keep trying different passwords. Okay. There are two types of brute force attack. Online, which is what it would say as a name, discover from an online system. So let's say a website or something, an account that would be connected onto the internet. Now, to combat this, we wanted to use account lockout. So if it attempts 5 times and if that's unsuccessful, we would lock out the account for a period of time. This is why I keep saying to everybody that security is not about full 100% protection. It's about buying time. So that way you can improve your protection. Because during that lockout, what you can do is you can look at if someone is attempting to access that account, right? So because in brute force, it would just keep on trying continuously. Most company would do a 5 times, as you know, if you ever use this online, and sometime if you don't log in, right, correctly 5 times, it makes you wait, right? Then you have to reset your password and then you wouldn't be able to log in. Also, we can implement a thing called Secure Shell, SSH. And Secure Shell allows communication to be established directly from that client system to the destination system. So that way it would disconnect the attacker, right, if that person is not attempting within the 60 seconds. So it's not completely a foolproof solution, but like I said, we're buying time. Okay. Another type of brute force is offline. And this is just to attempt to discover password from a captured database or a packet scan. So what they can do is they can use Wireshark to scan and look at that packet, okay? Because in that packet, it would have information about password that you generated and sent, right? We would log in online. So if they can't do it online, they would study it offline and try it offline, okay? So this is why everybody wants complex passwords. We should really move away from passwords. Password is difficult to manage if you have a very large enterprise because, people resets. It's not 100% foolproof. If you have to require the user to use complex password, and you have to have proper cryptography implementation for the session, also how it's stored. Okay. And when the password is encrypted, it generates a hash value, but the hash value can be cracked. So think of it like I would have a locker combination to lock, some of my important belongings inside this container, right? Well, combinations can be cracked, right? Which is the hash. And using that, it would be able to interpret the password in plain text. okay? And so that's brute force is, you know, trying different combination, but in general, a lot of the times it's actually, you know, you can crack the hash first and it gives you everything that you need. Because in general, that's most of the tools that you would use for cracking passwords. So going back to questions earlier, how can they access my account if I'm logging in online, right? Ncrack is a tool that's used to crack passwords that are online. Also, it's used to, and under Ncrack, it has the AirCrack suite, which is used for wireless. Okay, so when I say wireless, that could be your Bluetooth, that could be, you know, technology that are wireless. Okay, so as they are flawed. Okay, so what you see is these tools, the way they're built is to really capitalize on the flawed areas of different protocols, right? Different design of systems and so forth. And no system is a perfect system. No software is a perfect software. This is what keeps people like me and potentially you for jobs, because from what we know since the beginning, security has always been around. It's just now more prevalent because there's more incidents that makes it to the media. Okay. All right. Another thing that I want to address is the dictionary attack. This uses dictionary words, names, right? So if I put down like California, it will be able to detect that. And there are different dictionary lists that people can download in different languages. So if you think, oh, okay, I'll just make it in Spanish, right? They would still be able to crack. So, you know, recently I started kind of just looking around and yeah, Chinese, Japanese, and all different languages. And then some of them, they give you like multiple languages in an Excel spreadsheet, and then you can convert it into a text file. So most of the tools would use a text file format. You can import that list in. You can also create it, right? There are people who create these text files already and just distribute it on the internet. So if you're using common words, okay, then like password or, you know, a name, things like that, easy. Okay, so common dictionary based password. So use complex password that doesn't exist. Walking away from this class, I want you to use passphrase. Okay, much longer than 8. And there are, you know, there are tons of tutorial videos on how to generate effective passwords, you know, and everybody has a different approach. Some administrator would train people on how to create it from like a little saying. But that would get complicated because it's difficult to remember, right? Because if you have 10 accounts and you have 10 different passwords, likely that you would forget at least one. Okay. And here we also see that there's hash. And often when someone tried to crack password, they would go for the hash first because, as I mentioned, password is stored encrypted. Okay. So, and they would do pass the hash attack. So in the hash attack, it uses these two protocol. I wanted to show you this so that way when you look at Kane today, you're gonna say, oh, that's what that is. Okay. It's gonna discover the user's password, okay, based on these two. The Microsoft LAN Manager for Microsoft System and the NT-LAN Manager, NTLM. They have a newer version of this. So when your password is stored in Windows 10 or Windows 7 or Windows 8 or the older Windows, it's still relying on these older technology to store with hash. And if we crack the hash, we would be able to get the password. okay? Do you have any question for me? I see some people type in the chat. Let me check that real quick. They do this to obtain, I think for, if you're looking at contact information, that usually pertains to your smart devices, and that comes in through permissions. But contact, I would not brute force the contact. If I was to attack, what I would want to do is I would social engineer the user to install something that would escalate my privilege. So that way, you know how when you install an app, it asks for contact access and all of that can be done in one shot. Much easier than trying to brute force the contact information. But all they have to do is to hack into your email account, and they have your contact list, because now our email account is tied to our smart devices, right? Like Google, and then, you know, for the iPhone, you have the Apple account. So in order to protect, you have to think about how the attacker would think, right? And this is why ethical hacking is a common type of job. This is, you know, as you get into risk analysis and even some of that, like you have to know the tactic in order to build the solution. Okay, so before my demo, I'll come back to the questions. So I want to show you, we'll come back to this. I pulled this, I did this for when I was at College of the Desert. So I speed it up a little bit for you guys, but you know, I didn't have a lot of time to put together another virtual machine this week. So I figure I just use my old Windows 7 and then, you know, but it would be the same on Windows 10. You can find a lot of YouTube video on this using Cain Enable. Cain been around for a long time. And it's used from a network standpoint to test people's passwords. Let's say that if I'm a network administrator or a security administrator, I can use this type of tool to look at if my users are creating secure password, complex password, right? So from an analysis standpoint, this is a good way to look at how secure are the passwords and how secure is your wireless and network overall. So I have one account that's administrator, which is this account, and this is the password. It has a default administrator account that Windows 7 have, and it doesn't have any password. I created 3 separate accounts, test 1, test 2, and test 3. And these are the passwords. ABC for test 1, ABC 123 for test 2, and ABC 12 for test 3. And so when we say, okay, well, if we use a super simple password, less characters, we use longer characters with numbers, right? And it would use less there. And then I have another account, IT, and the password is password, right? Not all IT people are also secure either, right? Because sometimes, you know, they could be careless. So I'm using a virtual machine, and I use VMware Workstation Player is a product. I'm going to try to see if this is, you know, if it does get a little spotty, then I'll jump on my other laptop. But when I tested last night, it seems to be okay. So 1 second. So let me open up my virtual machines and play it here. So this is a software tool that you can use to create virtual machine. The workstation player is free. The VMware Workstation, they give you a free trial, but I think it's like $60 for the year. And then if you're using Apple, you can use VMware vFusion, which is that same version in Apple and in Apple systems. And I think it's about $60 to $100. It depends. VMware also released other products for virtualization for server environment like vSphere. So when you use Practice Lab, you're actually using their virtual machines that were created, and I think they use Microsoft Hyper-V, which is very similar to this, right? There are only so many people that release virtualized products, and VMware is usually ranking within the top. They are one of the top company to work for because they treat their employees very well, okay? And they have expanded a lot since I knew of them since maybe mid 2000 or even earlier. And I've always used their products in different areas of my jobs. Okay, so let's play this virtual machine. And I'm sorry if it's a little smaller. It's because I didn't install the rest of the tools. So let's see. So keep in mind that this is Windows 7. And it's going to take a little bit to start my Windows. I allocated it about 2 gig of my system RAM. And for the operating system, I had originally created it with 60 virtual gigs, which equates out to about close to 7 gigabyte on my USB drives. Okay, so here are my users, right? And I'm going to go ahead and log in as the administrator. So I'm going to use the tool internally on this system so you can see. For the sake of time, we're not going to do it from external because, you know, there are many steps before that. So I just wanted to show you Kane on how quickly that can be. Let me make sure. Okay, so it's gonna load. Ask me later. Okay. Okay, so as you saw, right, it wanted me to, I used like the trial period from Microsoft. So it's an ISO that I had. So I downloaded and installed Kane. If you ever download Kane, be careful with the website that you use to download, right? Because a lot of them advertise too. And so you might get a bunch of stuff with it. So here is Kane. Let me see if I can full screen this a little bit. Can you guys see okay? All right. Sorry, the virtual machine is a little tiny. So, all right. So here is Kane, right? And Kane has many different tools that's built within. I call it Kane, but it's Kane Enable. And it's used by many different professional. Now, Kane is equipped with Kali Linux and other type of tools too, but this is, you know, this is the version for Windows. So here, what we can do is we can also use it for decoder, for network, for sniffing network, for cracking, which is what we're going to use. We can also trace. We can also use it for wireless, right? So to start, when you click on the cracker tab, what that will do is it's equipped to crack these type of hashes and a lot of these type of hashes, right? Because in all password is stored with hash. So in the database, you can do Microsoft SQL hashes, MySQL hashes if it's not Microsoft, Oracle, and so forth. And then it also have hashes with 802.11 suite for WPA. So, you know, like I mentioned last time in the last class that WPA is secure, but you know, it's people can attack WPA. WPA2 is better, of course. Okay, so I know that this is a Microsoft system, so I'm going to use LM and NTLM. Okay, and then I'm just going to go ahead and I wanted to include all the hashes that could be password history. You can also import in the SAM database, and SAM is when it would be tied to the security token for specific user account when they authenticate. So quickly that it gives me a list of all my users, right, on the system. And here it would tell me empty LM passwords and then the NT password. So I know that the administrator account didn't have a password. And then the guest, it didn't have a password. And that was the fault of Windows 7, was that you can, you know, even with Windows 10, you can have an account without password. Okay, so the hash information is here, right? And you can compare the hashes between the empty and the non-empty. It's slightly, the values are slightly different. Okay, so let's say that I wanted to crack the password for the user test1. Okay, and so when I right click this, I would see there's a dictionary attack, there's a brute force attack. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to brute force it so you can see. Okay, so here it tells me this is the hash for that user's password. And then we're going to go ahead and click start, right? So it's not finding anything on the LM, as you see that it would be empty. So I need to brute force it with the NTLM hashes. Okay, found it. Do you see it? It tells me that it starts from ABC and it found it right away. Okay, that takes less than a second. Okay, so it tells me here that plain text converted that hash into ABC password. Attack stop, one hash is cracked, and you can continue to do that. But then it plugged in the password that it found. So test 1 has been cracked. Let's try the test 2, which has numbers. Okay, actually I'm going to try test 3 first, which has numbers. So we're going to use again just this without the challenges, the NTLM, and then click start. And as you can see, when you add in the numbers and make your password longer, it takes a little bit more time, but not that much more. You see that? Because for my test 3, I have ABC12, which it found, and it has stopped after about 5 seconds or 6 seconds. And I'm running a virtual machine that's slow. It's 2 gigs with 2 gigs of RAM. Okay, so it plugs in the password there, and then let's try the test 3. Okay, so we're gonna brute force this one. This one has ABC123, remember? So it will take a little longer. And so as you increase the number of characters, right, you're getting a little bit more time. And if you make it more complex by throwing in symbols, so the estimate time here might not be all that accurate. And it tells you the number of passes the number of tries that it's trying at every second. So you can see that it plugs in different characters to get the hash match and convert it back to the plain text. So I simply add in number 3, which gives my password 6 character. It is a little bit longer, right? It didn't crack it in 6 seconds. It's simply, it will take a little bit longer, but it will be able to produce. So if somebody is brute forcing, they really have to have the time and, you know, the resources, the RAM, the processor, the, you know, the connectivity to that system to be able to brute force it. And you would only see the people who brute force this essentially, you know, if they have enough time on their hand. So for an attacker that has a very small window of time, likely that they won't brute force it. Or if they do, they already have some of the information going in. Okay. Now for the dictionary attack, it would only be effective for the attacker to have, you know, a decent list of dictionary words that they want to attempt. So if you're using a short list, that might not give you any kind of result, or it would take a long time to give you any result. Okay. So here it tells me it's going to be approximately 3 years before, but you know, it's an estimate. So maybe a day or two, it will be able to produce the 6 character password. Okay. Now they can run this on one system, and then they can run dictionary attack on another system, or that same system if it's able to utilize different processor core and such. Okay. Any question? Okay. So I wanted to show you this, and that's a very simple, quick demo, so that way you can kind of see what that would look like. But, you know, in the case where if they can use this for wireless, like I mentioned, they can use it for a lot of different areas. And so Kane is also a quick, light tool that, you know, that we can use for a lot of different things to assess. Okay, so once you have all the stuff plugged in, then you can start putting together a list of which user has weak password, which users have effective passwords, and then you can decide on, you know, who you want to be able to bring forward for the training or advice on how to create better passwords. Any question? Okay. All right, so let's continue. Yes, exit. So I'm gonna just shut this down because it's just gonna tie up some of my resources. So when we do testing, we use virtual machines so that way it doesn't, you know, create impact on our regular systems. And you can make virtual machines for all types of systems, Linux, Windows. And then on the Apple, I think it has the component now, Apple implemented ways you can use virtual machines on there, or you can buy a third-party product like VMware to be able to do that. Okay, so now you understand why we should have complex password. Okay. Okay. So as we touched on previously, we talked about DNS server. So what is used on the DNS server to prevent DNS poisoning? And we would use the DNSSEC. Make sure you know this for your quiz. That allows us to protect its records, and it prevent the poisoning attack. For number 9, that will be DNSSEC. For 10, it asks you what is used in an NTP amplification attack. And it uses monolith command to generate requests for the NTP server. That would flood the victim details. For number 11, the two types of brute force attack, you have the online, which is used to discover for online system. And then you have offline, which is used to discover for a capture or something that they would be able to acquire previously. Okay. So we need to use complex password, to prevent that from happening. And also account logout. You can require the user to use complex password, non-old password, so you can have it for history. So in the Windows environment, Microsoft has a console called Computer Management Console, and in here, if you have the professional, you can have the user account, but you can also let me see. Yeah, I don't have it on this system, but you can also use group policy in order to manage your user account. I can show you that next week when I use my other laptop, because on this one I have Windows 10 Home and it doesn't have all the tools. Okay. So for number 11, two types of brute force would be online and offline. And for 12, to reduce the risk of online and offline brute force attacks, simply we need to implement account lockout policy, how many failed attempts before it locks the user out. And 5 seems to be reasonable for many networks. Okay. And then you might see some that would only allow 3 times, right? Like as you would use different financial systems or financial website, they would only allow you to log in 3 times. If you do that unsuccessfully, it would lock you out for, let's say, a day or a few hours. Now you can always call them to reset, and then they have to verify who you are, right? So with that time, what we're doing is we're slowing down the attacker. With the lockout, we need to implement the duration, right? Put in a period of time where before the user can log in. So Microsoft allows, I think the default is 90 minutes, or some administrator, they would change it to 30 minutes. When I administered a lot of the network systems and the accounts, because I was one of the Microsoft administrator for a while too. And with Active Directory in Microsoft, I had implemented from 90 minutes to several hours. It depends on the sensitivity of the data. Now, if you lock them out too long, then they can't work. So it kind of eats up the company's time. So usually, 60 minutes to 90 minutes seems adequate. And then that way it gives you time to go back, even contact the user, and then to see if you can reset their account or verify who they are before you reset. So for 12, we want to put down account lockout policy, account lockout duration policy, complex password policy. And then also password history policy, so that way they cannot reuse their old password. And if you put in 5 as the value for the password history, that means they cannot use the last 5 passwords that they created. Because what if those passwords were shared? What if those passwords were keylogged, right? That's why they reset their password in the first place. So we want to make sure that we have some rules for the password history. So this is why when you're trying to log into certain sites and you can't reuse the same password over and over again. Some company would not allow you to use password that contain your username, and that's additional policy that they can implement. It cannot contain your birth date or any social security number. They can implement that. Okay, because all their developer has to do is to make sure that the conditions are implemented in those rules for that system, because password goes into database and the database developer, that's what they use to implement for that record. And it's a simple process. Okay. Then we should also train our user, and we should also store our password as encrypted files. But as you can see, Microsoft encryption doesn't always mean that it's not crackable. Sorry, my dogs keep wanting to come in and out of the house right now. So, any question with 12? Okay, so let's talk about Rainbow. So Rainbow came out a few years ago. Originally, they only did dictionary attack, and then it became brute force attack with dictionary. And then they also formulated the rainbow table. Here it talks about the birthday attack. So with the birthday attack is it does the hash collision. And so if the algorithm is created the same hash for different passwords, right? What it does, it uses that, and then it's able to guess potential passwords. With the rainbow table, it attempts to discover the password from the hash, and the rainbow is a database of pre-computed hash, and it's shared with many people. Okay. For specific applications or even systems. And what that will do is it would compare the hash from that record, and it can quickly guess the password. So it's like a list of pre-made hashes. So what companies been doing is they salt password, and salting is used to insert various random characters that are not related to that password. So for example, if my password is password, right? And when it converts it to the hash, what it will do is at a certain bits, would add in other bits to make it obscure or different than your original password. So salting is implemented to prevent rainbow attack, because if you already have that pre-calculated hash, and most of the time we would use hash algorithm that already exists in many systems, so it's already been discovered. So when you salt it, it changes the way the hashes look. So even when they're trying to discover from that hash, it won't give them a correct password. Okay, so it adds additional characters to the password hash, and it changes the way that the password look if they crack it. So for 13, we should use complex password to reduce the risk of the rainbow table attack. We can use password salting or salt the password. We can also create user awareness and training. Now, two different things, right? The user can be aware of it, but if they're not trained to follow procedures, then that's a different story. So we want to make sure that they're aware and they're trained. So those are the three things that we can implement to reduce the risk. We cannot eliminate it because, you know, people have flaws and system have flaws. Any question with 13? Okay. So let's talk about session hijack and also replay. So in a replay attack, the data of that session is captured, and they would use that data to impersonate the system. Okay, and that could be wired or wireless. More often in the wireless side because it's easier, right? They would scan, capture your packet information, use some of that information and look at the protocol and the timestamp, and then to be able to replay your data and impersonate you. So that's what's called a replay attack. So what they're saying here is that to help reduce this, we can look at different types of protocols and we can make sure that we're able to have timestamp and log all of this. Even though it's more of like a reactive approach, right? Even with the implementation of protocol, but we can reduce it to something that it's acceptable. Okay. And then there's the known plain text attacks. So we can talk about attacks for days. There's so many different areas, right? So they would have sample of plain text and ciphertext. So it's like a list of encrypted value for certain things, and then it would be equivalent to this plain text. What they can do is they can quickly decipher based on that list, very much like dictionary attack for password. So for encryption, that would be the known plain text attacks. And you know, if you're looking at the dark web, the list is commonly shared, right, in different forums, in different channel, in different areas. So this is how it gets circulated and spread across the world. Session hijack is often used with database like cross-site scripting, injection, and different areas. So what hijacking does is that they take over your session, and they could use URL injection. They can use SQL injection to get more data like passwords, bank account, social security number, like I mentioned. So there are different areas in hijacking. There's the typo swatting. So they, for example, like bankofamerica.com, right? They would put in an S or something that's close to that URL trying to trick you. So if you have a typo, it would redirect you to their website. And it looks like Bank of America, right? And they would make it look very much like the real thing with all the images. And then when you type in your login, they would keylog it, take your account information and use it for their own. click jacking tricks the user to click something other than intended. Okay, so you might see a little pop-up thing saying, you know, win $1 million here, right? Click here. And when you click it, it takes you to other things that you wanted to go, other than the website you wanted to visit. And you see this more now with a lot of like the low-end, highly advertised website. Okay. All that is it uses a just HTML frame that allows the web page to have certain defined areas. So for many companies that have online websites, right, they need to really control that area by looking at how they design the HTML frame. Questions? Okay, so the session hijack, it really takes the session ID, which is stored in your cookies. Every single site now has required cookies because it's a way for them to analyze your buying pattern, your web pattern, etc. Right? Yes, you can disable some of that. Yes, you can delete the cookie, but the cookies is established for that session. The cookie can contain your authentication token. It can contain a lot of the communication information. So what that session hijack really means is they would capture your cookie and they would poison the cookie. When I say poison, it's exactly like all the other attacks. They would take the information in your cookie, and instead of saying that your cookie is for your computer, they would put in that cookie for their computer. And then they can take over your session. Could be for online purchasing, online transfer, things like that. Okay, so during the process, they need to impersonate the user to the web server. They need to be able to read and do some form of scripting attack, like cross-site scripting, to obtain the cookies. Then they would insert their session ID instead of yours, so that way they would access your account as you. Okay. There's a company that does a very good job in demonstrating this. They're called Imperva. I met the chief technology. And they did a bunch of videos on this. Okay. They did like backdoor attack, shell and Trojan, SQL injection. I think their SQL injection, let me see if I can find it. They have a series of it. It's kind of older, but Brian Contoso, he's one that usually does a lot of the demo. So if you like, you can find their channel and follow their channel, and they have really great tutorials. And he sets up like different web servers where they simulate it and be able to demonstrate it. And then they have, you know, other areas, but Imperva is the company's name. They do security solutions. And I have worked with them previously, so they do a good job. Okay. Okay, any questions? All right, so for 14, we can put that in the session hijacking attack. It would take advantage of the session ID stored in cookies. Then it would impersonate the user with the web server, read the cookies through cross-site scripting attack to obtain that session ID, insert the ID into HTTP header, send it to the website, and access the user account. Okay. So usually before this, they would have to really watch the traffic. They really investigate that user, right? A smart attacker is a well-researched attacker. And from that point, when I teach, you know, ethical hacking, I always said that you got to do your homework before you attempt. Nobody goes into it not knowing, because you will likely get stuck or be able to have to start all over again. Any question? So if you do take Security Plus, right, it asks a lot of these questions. It also, if you take like other security type of certification, CISA, or even from other vendor, right, like EC Console, CEH, not that you have to answer the question, you have to show them that you could do it. So there will be times that you have to illustrate that you could do it. Okay, so I'll go over a few more before we take a break, and then when we come back, I will touch on a little bit on what's the difference between penetration testing and ethical hacking, and what type of attackers that you really see. You know, some of the things that we need to really keep an eye out for as users, and you know, when you work in the field, what should you be really looking into? Because in security, the regular type of jobs that you see is, you know, most people, they like to get into pen testing and ethical hacking because it has a lot of like technical components. And it's different from one company to the next. It also gives you a lot of great experience, but yet at the same time, it requires a lot of effort too. Okay. Question. Okay. So another one we need to watch out for would be the answer for 15, but here it talks about domain hijacking, where they can hijack the whole entire domain name. And then man in the browser, kind of like man in the middle, but man in the browser. So earlier, I think Michelle brought up that, you know, she had this incident happens, and possibly it's a Trojan that's sitting in your computer, or it could be on their end too, right? So man in the browser, it's a type of proxy Trojan that infects different browsers, okay? And this is why you should update your browser, because it closed out some of the security issues. It captured the browser session using keylogger. And the old one, Zeus, been around since the XP days. So Zeus is a common one that they would use for key logging. Okay. And from Zeus, there came other form of keyloggers. So that source code been shared. And sometimes they would put up fake websites to, and like I said, right, and then run the Trojan in the back to capture. Or they would get you to download it and then be able to get your keylog. So it's a way that they can collect your authentication information, and it's a lot easier to do it that way than just trying to brute force. And you know, if I was the attacker, if I brute force, likely that I will be detected quickly, right? And I wouldn't have that much time. So you know, if I can trick the user to download something, or if I can place something on the domain, like I would infect that domain, then like make it a water hole, then I would just, it would just my game all day. Okay. So for the next question, when you put down what tool is used to capture session in man in the middle or man in the browser attack, they would use a Trojan horse. Okay, and Trojan, all it is it's not what it looks like, right? It looks like a common file, but it's not. So if you question it, scan it, right? Research it. And they can capture your browser session data using a keylogger that can be incorporated inside the Trojan. And another form of it, you don't have to put down a third one, but if you want, you can look at Zeus, and it locks a keystroke, and it collects authentication information. So in development, they constantly would have to think about security and design. People didn't really do this before, right? As much as they are now. They did, but not as emphasized as now. So what you have is you have developers that work on drivers, that work on operating system, that work on applications. And with that, you have attacker to take down those things, okay? So they can manipulate a driver by using a technique called shimming. And so what we can do is, it says shimming provides the solution to make it appear that older drivers are compatible, additional code that run instead of the original driver. Okay, so it's not really the original driver. And then refactoring the code that rewrites internal processes. So at this point, it is a low-level programming, and it causes different behavior or changes to your operating system. In the operating system, you know, this gets into the kernel where it's protected from the user. So what you have is you do have areas that in development that's weak, which causes this to occur. And you probably hear 0 days a lot. 0-day attacks, basically, they already know of the vulnerability or a bug in that software, and then they capitalize on it as it releases or even before it releases. So this is why company quickly have to fix or patch it, like Microsoft, right? Because exploits would occur. And with memory buffer overflow, it's just a memory leak. And it's because if you use languages like C#, C++, Java, object-oriented programming approach, what happened is we create object and we store it in the memory. And, you know, some of the newer languages like Java, it cleans up automatically, but and that space is used for stack. And so when you exceed that space, right, you cause memory leak, and it just consume more of the system resources. Okay. So what they can also do is they can manipulate the code to exceed the memory, the buffer, and cripple that application. Okay. Buffer overflow can be used in many different ways. That's just in a simple example. How would you go about writing the code for the driver? You would have, so it depends on the type of driver that you're trying to write. A lot of the times this comes back to assembly language, and the assembly language is usually written for processor, because the driver is used to do what? To let the processor know that, you know, these are the capability of that device. So when you're looking at Linux and you're looking at like the type of architecture that it supports, so, you know, then you have to look at, is it Intel based, is it AMD? A lot of the times they write it to the AMD, and there's only like so many languages that would be compatible to that particular architecture. So for example, a lot of the Linux systems use, because of the processor, that processor would use ARM, and there's different version of ARM. On the higher programming level, right, a lot of people would go with like C or Java, but like, for example, for Microsoft, you would use C# for a lot of their type of applications and resources. But for Microsoft itself, it uses Microsoft ASM for assembly. So you can think about, you know, you can research on how some of the developer actually construct a lot of these driver, and also you have to look at the chips on that device. So if we're looking at USB, like a flash drive, it does contain that chip, and what does that, what languages is that we can use to write instruction for that device. So okay. Okay, so I think the rest of this is about injections that's related to dynamic library, pointer dereference, and some of the things in development, which is, you know, if you're in computer science and that area, this is what you're going to be really looking at, is how to be able to control the security part, is to properly use pointer to prevent applications from rewriting, right? Like something with injection. Also how your runtime would be because of your stack size, input validation, and exception detection or error detection is very important. So before we take a break, I wanted to bring up the areas that you need to really think about, right, to prevent some of the development side attack. So for buffer overflows, we want to make sure that we handle error routines, right? I just went over exception with my Python class, and you know, a lot of it is that we usually just look at the user end, but you need to look at your routines and how the task is implemented if that's causing any kind of logic error, because that can cause issue with your application. And in our case here, that will be related to buffer. Input validation needs to be used to prevent buffer overflow as well. Why is that? Because they can inject into that field that you have the user input, and that can exceed, right? And it will just keep storing more and more and more information, or they can put in the code, the script directly into that form. So we wanted to make sure that we control what is being inputted, so that way, number one, it's easy for us to clean up our data. Number two, to prevent somebody from injecting scripts, like SQL injection, you know, a lot of different type of injection as you see now, that to cause different issues for us. And then lastly, the protocols that's used for denial of service is often you would see user datagram protocol, because UDP doesn't verify, right? There's no acknowledgement, and like TCP. So it just opens as it receives, okay? So with that, what happens is they can use UDP to be able to cause network floods, different type of DOS, okay? All right. So when we come back in 15 minutes, I want to go over a little bit on pen testing and EH, like I mentioned, and then we'll talk about the lab and we'll call it a day. Okay. All right. So let's take 15-minute break. Let's be back. It's 2:07 on my clock. So be about 2:22.
Real quick, I have a question. Are you saying PIN like PIN or PEN?
Pen is PEN, like penetration testing.
Oh, PEN.
Yeah. So they don't say penetration testing because, you know, a lot of people have dirty minds. So they just say pen testing. It's just a way that we wanted to see how we can penetrate a network or a system. All that is just, you know, like using different form of attacks or tactics to get into a system or network. And people are getting paid to do that, right? Professionally. And, you know, a lot of people know security for that type of jobs, but there are other form of jobs too, right? Like just to analyze data, to implement things, to test codes, stuff like that.
Great. Thank you so much for clarification.
Oh yeah, no problem. Okay, so as we're coming back from our short break, you're welcome. I wanted to talk a little bit about, things that you can potentially look into. And a lot of times when you look at cybersecurity job, right, the jobs can be, the requirement seems quite challenging to start, right? Just like in computer science and other areas. But what you want to do is you want to be able to have some experience, various things. But the things that they really look at from for the IT industry and the security industry is certification. And so when we say certification, it's industry vendor certifications. So outside of Cisco, right, and CompTIA, there's a company called EC Console. And EC Console certify in different areas for the defender, the tester. They also offer classes and training because now everybody's getting into that. We do teach at Moreno Valley College the ethical hacking course, which is CIS824C. It will likely be offered in the fall of next year. I don't have it on schedule for spring, but I know RCC also teaches that. Skip Berry, I work with Skip. So what you can do is you can take a look at the type of certification. Now, for the student that take forensic and the CEH, EC Council just released a new certification called Associates for Certified Ethical Hacking and Associates for Computer Forensic. That means that, this type of certification usually require 3 to 5 years experience to even certify. And the industry came back and said, this is really hard for somebody who wants to do this, from school or while they're in school. So they had released associates. And as of last week, I submitted a purchase for the license for those type of certification. So once the student completed CIS 27, 27A, 27B, they can attempt for the certification. And it's a little difficult. However, if you study and prepare after you take the class, you would be able to pass. I recall that when they first released the ethical hacking certification, it was $150 way back. I'm talking at least more than decades ago, right? 1 decade. Now, because it's highly demanded, they had raised up the price close to $1,000. And it's difficult for students to acquire it. So I was able to get some funding that's going to help students getting the associate's level. So once you have the associate level of certified ethical hacking, you can pursue apprenticeship and internship to get, at least a couple years experience, and then you can transition to the professional CEH. And in some other cases, like most of my former students, once they have a certain certification, they can continue working, maintaining that certification without getting additional certification unless the company pays for it. So many of them ended up getting other certification because the company paid for it. And then some, they don't get additional certification because they have the experience to back it up. So you can check out this organization that offers this, okay? And, it talks about different type of certifications and programs, etc. Okay, so with that, this is a presentation that I normally do for security, kind of give people an overview on this type of profession because many students want to get into this area. And looking at attack surface, right? We talked a lot about attacks today. So And normally we would have data from the prior year. So you do see some 2019 data in this. As we close out the last quarter for 2020, we would have additional data, right, on new form of attacks or malware and different things in the next year for 2020. So this presentation is focused on pen testing and attacks and ethical hacking. So the vectors that we see as threats in the field for 2019, this kind of give you the overall picture. It doesn't go into every single vector, but these are some of the areas we need to look at. Number one, as we talked about earlier, Trojan is reducing. So the use of Trojan from 2018 into 2019 wasn't as high. But as you can see, the number is still tagging at about 6 million Trojan surfacing in the wild. The hacking tools that are used, good or bad, right? It has been increasing, and possibly because companies are looking at using the tools for internal assessment. And then you also have external attackers or attackers in general that's using it for other reasons. So you're looking at approximately 3.2 million with hacking tool use. Backdoors is close to 600,000, which is less than what we've seen in 2018. And that means that companies are doing a better job in the development area in, reducing the use of backdoor. Hijackers looking at about 200,000 that's actually recognized, and they use monitoring system and traffic to be able to determine that. Email that contains malware is of course always so high. It's about 94% of the email contain malware across. Okay, and they use surveys, analysis, results, reports, different things in this type of research. 63% of the companies have leaked data or compromised systems. That's within the 12-month span of 2019. And when you're looking at exploitable vulnerabilities that could be used for 0-day or other areas, it's more than 11,000, and it's climbing. And so when we're looking at phishing attacks, and to calculate it out to the dollars, because that's what we do, is when we look at loss and potential loss, how is that going to mean to the business? So on average, when you see this, it's about $17,000 of loss every minute due to phishing. And that means that the users are not practicing the right thing. They're still giving out information. They're still falling into these traps. So we have to do a better job of educating people and training people. Okay, so that kind of give you a big picture of what happened last year. And so when we're comparing operating system, because there's always an argument on which one is better in security. So when we're looking at threat detection, actually from 2019, Windows OS is about 5.8, close to 6 threats per system on average. Mac OS has climbed quite a bit since 2018, and it's at 11 per system. So as you know now that more people own iPhones and iMac and MacBook, therefore you do see more threat services for those type of systems. Okay. So think about that when you're purchasing devices and using these devices at home or in your business. And we do see a lot of web skimmers. And so steganography is a way that people can hide codes inside different type of file or data. So, and it can use either way. We can use it for, to prevent the user from accessing certain things, or the attacker can use this to hide malicious code. They can embed it into images like what we talked about last time. Also, In the web for skimming, we also see exploit kits being used, and you saw the numbers for exploit kits. And then we have malvertisement, which is bad advertisement and redirection campaigns. And I'm seeing more in 2020 also, but we started to see more of that since 2018 for 2019. Okay. So some of the exploit kits, these are just some of the top exploit kits that I pulled. So you have the Fallout, Spillovo, and different type of exploit kits. These are downloadable, they're shared, right? They can be found. So these are the common ones that were used in 2019. And when we say kits, we would have many different tools inside each kit for different vulnerability. Okay. And it's spread across the world. So when you're looking at which countries releasing that, you do see some South American country, you do see a lot of Ukraine kits, you do see, so it kind of spread across on who really created these kits and distributed or where it comes from. So who are they really targeting, right? Single individuals, of course, right, for various reasons. Healthcare, big, very big. This is why hospitals and healthcare organization always look for security people, because there's a need with the regulation, and also they're a huge target with health records. Government entity could possibly be, uh, dealing with warfare, also dealing with, that nation's safety and the people. And then as we have more cryptocurrency exchange, they become the target. And then, of course, education, finance, law enforcement, transportation, big with airport, when we look at physical security and also system security, and then job sites. Okay, so job seeking means, like Indeed, Hot Jobs, those type of sites. Okay. So from the user end, what can a person do really, right? Reduce your app use. If you don't use that app, you should uninstall that app. You need to take a look at app permissions on what it's really accessing. Because once we authorize that permission, it takes control over that, and that can create issues for the user. If you do, when you log in, you should try to use multi-factor authentication, not just passwords. So companies are better at implementing multi-factor, like I said, but try to use more biometrics. And our biometric detection system has gotten way better with, facial recognition, fingerprint recognition, voice recognition. And you should use multi-form of the biometrics as well. Never rely on one form. Try to use passphrase. Update your printer firmware. Okay. And before you get into buying the technology, you should research its security, especially Internet of Things devices, smart devices for your home. While many of these companies now, they're required to maintain some of this, but a lot of the times it's a reactive approach, meaning that they don't fix the problem until it's found. So what you would see is that there are many researchers in security that test these things and they bring it to the awareness of the company. Car hacking has been pretty prevalent recently, right? You've probably seen videos that people hack into cars to cause it to stop and go or do certain things, because car contains computing board. And so therefore you would see a lot of that. And due to some of the researcher, many of the companies, including GM, Chevrolet, right? Like GM and Ford, they had fixed some of the problems on the cars. Dealing with Wi-Fi, dealing with, control of brake systems, control of steering system, etc. So as our car gets smarter, right, and more connected to the interweb, we have to think about the security side. So when you stream from your car or when you're using your car, right, think about how often your firmware has been updated by that organization. And if you don't service your car at the dealership, likely that your firmware was not updated. Okay, so you have to find ways to be able to secure your car. Making sure that we're more aware of what type of emails that we're getting, unknown sources don't open. Okay, and set up your email folder rules to screen out all of these email. Update your mobile devices and your smart systems, right? I just have a practice where every 2 weeks or every other weeks, I check my TV and any smart devices that I use, and then I turn off some of the features when I don't use it. Encryption, right? Encryption attack is more prevalent because now everybody uses encryption. And even with your home network, you need to really take a look at, which system is accessing your network. Even though sometimes, we're busy, I understand that. But once in a while, you should take a look. So that way, if you find unknown systems on there, you should implement more security on your network and change up, your keys, things like that to better protect yourself. Access point needs to be authenticated and strictly authorized. So if we started to use smart locks and things like that, we need to make sure that those smart locks is capable of protecting our homes, and also the system needs to be physically secured. Okay, because it's simply cutting the cable that's going to cripple you. So, and avoid Wi-Fi in general. Who can see you? You can't see them, but they can see you. So, public Wi-Fi, like at Walmart, restaurants, things like that, hotel, public transportation, even transportation company, train, plane, be careful with those, okay? And if you need to, right, you can, if you want to be more secure, you can ask to see if they provide any kind of security access where they can track and monitor. But, you can use your smartphone to be able to connect to the internet, and you can tether and so forth. So who are really the attackers? I mentioned script kiddies already. They're homegrown hackers, and they just use different type of tools that they can find. And a lot of the times they're not educated enough to know the consequences or, the capability of the tools, so that can be dangerous. Many people would get into ethical hacking and they become a white hat hacker. And so ethical hackers use pen testing technique and tools to assess the network, and they get paid to do that. I've done that quite a bit throughout my career. And so therefore you have to have good networking knowledge. And if you have good programming knowledge, that's also a plus. The black hat hacker sometimes could be crackers. They would build tools to circumvent networking system for bad intention. And the intention would fall into the scope of monetary gain, political fame, revenge, so those are some of the main areas usually that they would operate. Many people would go for the money. Gray hat would be across, so they don't truly have a malicious intention or a benevolent intent. Some people would fall into this category in such that they would cross over from the white to more of the gray side, in that they would, uh, be able to test some system, but they don't really have an intention to report it, or they don't have an intention to destroy it. So you do see some professionals that are in the gray area, depending on, the scenario, coming from the white hat. You got the green hat, they're known as noobs, and they're full-blown hackers. They would seek information and resources for gain. Okay. Red hats are vigilantes. So these are the people that report and defeat malicious hackers. They're the superhero of the security world. And blue hat hackers are also script kiddies with a vengeance. So they have no desire to learn and they attempt to attack enemies. So they are full force. So now we have more categories. When I began my career, it was just white hat, black hat. Now we have other categories that are in the mix. Okay. So penetration testing, also known as pen testing, focuses on a few areas: discovering vulnerabilities, risks, and target environment. And that's your objective. And you would use that to better secure the system and better control the system. Okay. And it really comes back to the organizational defense system, right? Which consists of network appliances, computers, and anything that's connected to the infrastructure. For ethical hacking, it covers all hacking techniques associated with different form of attacks, different security flaws. Again, we go back to vulnerabilities and ensuring the security of the target system. So it can go beyond permissions to actually it goes beyond hacking the system, but you have to work under what's permitted. Okay. So people often mix up the two. So when a person becomes an ethical hacker, they perform penetration testing techniques. Okay. And when you become a pen tester, you simply just look at risk and vulnerability of the target system. And then you would use that to improve. For an ethical hacking, they hack in all aspects. Could be for applications, could be for different areas. And so that way, again, we want to report. So it kind of blend in together. So people tend to mix it up. Okay. So if somebody wants to be a pen tester, what do they need? They need to have a comprehensive knowledge of everything rather one area. Okay. And some of these people, they will move on to become security architect, right? Or, network defender, etc. Okay. So there are different titles with every organization. And they can also test input. They can access different type of area to perform testing. So when we're saying network in general, that's very large. So you can look at different servers, you can look at different areas that you can see if you can penetrate. And less paperwork than the ethical hacking side, right? But you still have to sign the scope of work agreement, non-disclosure agreement, and other things that the company would require. Okay, many times you cannot talk about what you've done because that would share the secret and that will violate the non-disclosure agreement. Okay, and you would require less time to do pen testing. So maybe a couple of days or even 1 day or hours. Ethical hacking would need to also have software programming knowledge, scripting knowledge. Essentially, they become an expert in report writing. So the difference between an ethical hacker and a full-blown black hat attacker would be that we, at the end of the day, write a report so that way we can learn from the issues that we have. Okay, and that report is what pays the bill. Okay, so you would break down each of the section explaining what are the issues and give recommendation on how to fix it. And the companies, they're not required to fix that, right? They would read the report and they would say, oh, okay, so we would have enough money to do this and this and this. And a lot of the times they would fix the minimal to make sure it passed regulation or to operate normally for most part. You would require to have legal agreement. And I tell all my security students, don't start doing the work unless you sign and have your legal person or review the details, because in some cases that can get you into some of the trouble area. And so making sure that you agree your agreement is very clear. If you have questions, you should ask them before you start the job. And that can be contracted as consultants. So when you see a lot of the security consultant, this is what they also be doing. Okay, so it would require a lot of time and effort compared to pen testing, and you would need to assess different system and infrastructure. Okay, so what are the phases in this then? If I'm going to do this, what am I going to do, right? What are some of the steps? So the first part is they would recon, which is to scan, sniff, and script. Okay. And so from a defender perspective, simply just know your network security, right? Having layered approach. The initial exploitation, so once they recon, they would find out more about what they can access. Okay, and that process can take a long time or not. It depends on how secure it is for that network. Then they would have intrusion. That's when they would start entering and exploiting. Okay, infecting. Okay, disrupting, causing issues. Okay, so what can we do from a perspective of a security? We can apply policy, rules, procedure, and making sure our people are having the right practices, monitor the network traffic. After they intrude, then they would establish what's called persistence. So would be escalation of privileges, gain additional access and control, so that way they can find out more or access different system to take more data. The way that we would combat this is to have external control, remove unnecessary pathways and ports, and block the ports is commonly the phrase. Once they gain privileges, they're gonna move across. So move laterally, finding key pieces to their goals. And so we would limit administrator access. We would monitor our logs. We would isolate different segment of the network, and we would isolate different data. Okay. Once they have moved laterally, phase 5 is to collect and exploit. So they would have all the data that they would need, they would sell it and leave. Sometimes they would leave a backdoor so they can come back. Okay. In many cases, they would come back. It's kind of like a robber robbed the bank and then put a little small entrance so that way they can re-enter the bank and take more money. So we need to improve our system policies and analyze all logs to detect malicious activity. For ethical hacking, so here it tells you a little bit about the intention. Most businesses use ethical hacker to learn more about their security issues. Okay. Now it's imperative that they only perform their job so that way they can provide defensive tactic for the clients, and that's the job of the ethical hacker. Okay, so code of ethics is important, right? That this can make or break the career. Always obtain written permission to start. Perform only ethically, and because we need to understand the business direction and mission, so that way we can do our job. before you perform any kind of ethical hacking duties, you need to determine what is sensitive, what is confidential. So that way you would look at those and treat those and see how those are tied to business operation. You cannot go beyond the limit. So if they say that, you know, the contract is only for the database server, even if you could see other server, you cannot look in those. Okay, that violates the rule. And after perform, you cannot tell this to other clients, right? People put logo on their website saying these are the clients, that's okay, but you cannot disclose the specifics, like what you've done, what kind of tools you use, what you find, you cannot, okay? So here are the rules, okay? We cannot hack our enemies. We cannot hack without authorization. We cannot exceed our hacking scope. We cannot hack our friends, neighbors, and acquaintances, even if they make you angry, I know. But no, we don't do that. Even if you see it, right? Now the gray hat, sometimes they would do discovery, right? And then they would go and tell people, and then sometimes they don't. So really for the white hat hacker, we want to stay within the scope of our job. So we want to make sure that we don't, you know, exploit the privacy of other networks and other individuals. We always write a report of what we find. So this is why, you know, the writing skills comes into play. Okay, so here's some of the methodology. So you have to have in-depth security assessment and audit. That takes time, and it takes, you know, knowledge and effort. We need to understand rules and practices and procedure. Pen testing methodology is a way that we would map out ideas by practices, and these practices has been proven. So that way we can look at the true security posture where it would withstand, right, or reduce or minimize the risk for the application in the system. Okay, so how do we test these things, right? As I told you before, we want to be able to have systems and tools to be able to test it. Now, internally, a company can have these type of testing: black box, white box, and gray box. So when they do black box testing, it's really mimicking the real world attack. Like what would happen if this was being attacked realistically? And some cases, the tester would have no knowledge of the system. So we call that blind or double blind testing, where you have very little knowledge of their system and network. It's very time consuming. Okay. White box testing, you would have all the knowledge of the system, and you would do this as an insider too. And people would do this before production or release, like testing application, security tests, some of the hardware devices, IoT devices, etc. It's cost effective, okay? But it does have a limit in such that we would only test based on our knowledge and skills. So outside of that scope, we would not know. Gray box testing, you would know some information about the system, and it would only focus on specific goals, okay? So they would use this for validating security control, and without, you know, so we can do this while it's being used, or you know, if you take it offline for a short period, you can do gray box. So to test what are the operating system, and you should only use virtual machines when you do this, okay? Do not use your regular systems. So Kali Linux is a common one, and it's very, and Kali Linux changes a lot, right? A lot of these operating system changes. So you might have a version from last year, it has a different tools from this year, they add or remove some of the ineffective tools, of course. So on the right here is Kali. The symbol for that is the dragon with the wing. Parrot is used for cloud. I've used Parrot before. And it's also a Linux distribution. It's good. And Kali has forensic tools, so is this one. But if you're working with cloud-based company, it's good to use a different operating system or multiple. And then there's Backbox Linux. This is Ubuntu based, also a Linux operating system. And this has a lot of the network and application analysis. So some are better than other in different areas. Okay. And then if you do web testing, they have newer frameworks now, but Samurai is one of the Linux environment that's often used for web-based testing. And they have a framework that you would follow for development and web-based testing. And these are the main of top 5. You would see others as well too. Pen2 is also used for pen testing, and some of these are available with live USB or live CD. And this is going to be used for specific purposes. So if you wanted to run it and assess it, so they have specific tools. So I've used Pen2. It's not one of my favorites. The one that I go to are, this is Kali, Parrot, Backbox sometimes, but you know, and then lately I've been doing a lot of trying to gain more skills in the web development as it changes so fast, so quickly. The tools that they use, you know, even on the UI end, it's just so fast and change. So I have to really find the tools that would be adaptable in different cases. Okay. So here are the steps overall. You have target scoping, information gathering, discovery of the target. That's when they look at OS, right? Network status. Enumerating target, looking at ports, open ports. They map the vulnerability based on the ports that they found. Social engineering, and then exploitation, privilege escalation, stay in, maintain access, and then document and report. So when you work toward CEH or pen testing certification, CompTIA offers Pen Test Plus now, you have to know these steps, okay? Because this is what that type of profession would be, right? What's entailed in it, etc. Okay, so here are some of the questions in different steps there. Okay, so where do they really get the information? Online. Oh, I have a typo there. News groups, articles, social networks, commercial, non-commercial website using Whois, and of course, dark web. Okay. So in target discovery, these are some of the things that we do. We do passive scan. So the difference between active and passive, right? Passive is that your system doesn't tell the other system who it is, it just scans. Active scan is that when it scans, it's going to say, hey, I'm looking for information. Give it to me. I am here. I'm this system. I have this name, this IP, etc. Okay. So some of the network sniffer, like Wireshark, is passive. Okay. And then when you get into Nmap or ZenMap, that's active scan. It calls home. So because it has to bring the information back to you, right? Like when you use traceroute, that's active because it reports back to you from that traffic. Okay. And this is more of like the specific tools area. Okay. And you can use all of this in Kali if you like. So when I teach CEH, they actually have to do some of that. And you saw some of this if you took the networking one where it shows you how to look at some information. So know your commands, very important in terminal and command prompt. And then enumerations, how to do that with different tools. Okay, Wireshark, P0F, Nmap, to look for ports, to look for open ports. That's the goal for a target enumeration. For target scanners using Nessus, Nessus license for professional is very expensive. I think it's $1,000 per license, but you can use the home license. Nessus is really good at doing inventory of your system and assessing vulnerability with that. In Windows environment, you can use Baseline Analyzer, Microsoft Baseline Analyzer, to really assess it at the low level. You can also use Unicorn, AMAP. So, and these are command lines. So when we look at vulnerability, we look at design, implementation, and operation. Okay, so that kind of give you some details there, glitches, software specifications, how systems are deployed, and what kind of weaknesses does it have. And when we're looking at pre-exploitation, there are 3 stages: pre-exploitation and post. So you have to look at the scope and the time estimation from that scope. And then you would enumerate the countermeasures. So if they have things like intrusion prevention system, firewall, right? As a tester, you get paid to do this professionally. You would adjust your attack based on the type of system they have and exploit it. And then when you find the issues, you would document it. And then for the post exploitation, right, determine the compromised machine information, and then you have to make sure that if you disable their control, you got to put it back after you're done. Okay, and those are my references. Do you have any question for me? I saw some chat questions. So if you are interested in this type of assessment and learning more about attacks and how to do this professionally, or what would people do as a security professional, CIS824C is the class. Like I said, I don't think we're going to offer in spring. I can ask, but we are looking to offer in fall. Okay. And you know, if you wanted to get more on the forensic side, it's CIS27A. So there's CIS27, which is the Security Plus, CIS27A, which is Computer Forensics, CIS27B, which is Ethical Hacking. Okay, and those are the 3 that you often see, they go together. So you have to take 27. This class, I build it based on content from CIS27. This is why you see this presentation, because when I teach Security Plus, we do some commands and we do some of this, and we create virtual machines because I would have more time with the students to give them more technical hands-on. As we move through the course with 4 weeks, it's, you know, it's a non-credit, so we wanted to make sure that it's light enough, but we give you enough information. So that kind of answer your questions there. Okay. And you know, my former student, they have asked me if I'm interested. They wanted to come and do demo for my students. So when we do go back to campus, I like to have guest speakers like that. Some of them are very successful doing this, and they do this for a living. And then they move into like the architect, the CIO area. But, you know, they did this for many years. So I've taught security for a long time now, so this is not new to me. And you know, my degree is in security. So okay. Questions? And Mr. Barry at RCC, it's great. He's great. He's CISSP certified. He has his own company as well. He's doing consulting and he teaches. So before he became an instructor, he came from that side too. So he, you know, he implemented the security for the district and so forth. Okay. So any questions regarding, so I uploaded the PDF for you. You have access to that now. So in case you wanted to know which tool, how the steps. Also, I'm going to recommend a textbook. It's cheap. If you wanted to learn Kali, you can go to Kali, and Kali does their own certification for pen testing. Okay. So if you get really good at Kali, okay, you can look at their certifications. Okay. And you can get that. So if you wanted to be either red team or blue team, defender or attacker, like you can get into that area. So Kali does a good job at documenting and the tools, the resources, the features. And then they even have pre-made virtual machine that you can download and use VMware or VBox, VirtualBox to be able to open. Now, you know, I would put it on a USB drive and not store it on your computer, okay? And then use it when you want. You can also run Kali on BlackBerry or sorry, Raspberry, but Raspberry is very limited that it's, you know, it's only to its architecture. So I do have Practice Lab Kali, but it's a little slow, right? I read the survey comment from many of my classes. Practice Lab, as more people get on it, it's slow. Okay. All right. So next lab, I will look into adding, you know, some Kali exercises for you so you can have a taste of it. But keep in mind that their Kali virtual machine is a little slow as we use it for many different security classes. So that was a big complaint from my CIS27 and other classes that would be using Kali. And we shared the license with the region. So eventually we'll be able to have a secondary product, but you know that these licenses are not very cheap. And to be able to have it for student to use it for free, we have to make it a regional project where, you know, some funding came from each college and then it's shared across. So that way you don't have to pay out of pocket to be able to use that. If you go through CompTIA or EC Council or the other organization, you have to pay for the lab access. And that can range from $100 to several $100s or even $1,000 or more, right? I know SANS charge $4,000 for their Windows security course, where, you know, they teach you how to hack Windows and protect Windows, and even Linux ones. So, you know, I'm always pro student not paying any extra. So I'm always working toward those type of grants to make sure that everybody can get it for free because this is public institution. All right, so Kali is a good one if you wanted to professionally certify with them, right? That's also a good one to look at. The textbook I meant to put. So if you use Amazon or a different source, right, you can look for Kali pen testing, and Packet T had released some. So if you start at the beginning, they do a good job at giving you some exercises, or you can follow the example exercises. So they have quite a few textbook. Even sometimes when I wanted to see, you know, how they would approach some exercises, I sometimes would buy textbook or get a copy as a faculty. So there are a lot of different type of book. I have this one. I recommend it. I like it a lot. It has some of the tutorials that's built within. This one, if you read it for free, it's good. It's not a textbook. It's more of like a guide. It's okay. And then if you wanted to get wireless, so Packet T released quite a few books that are great. I also own Hacker Playbook 1, 2, and 3. The first one was not that great. These ones are good for little tips on the red and the blue team side. I think this one focuses more on the attacker standpoint. So you do see some authors that release some of these. Now, you want to use the latest Kali, which is 2020. So when they wrote it like this, some of the tools might still exist and some might not. So when you get a dated Kali Linux book, you might not have all the updated information. So just use the documentation. And so as you can see, they have a lot of different books that's written to pen testing. Okay. And I currently use a digital forensic from Packet T, not this one because this one is only for Linux and it goes both ways. It's Windows, Linux, and other areas. Okay, questions? Okay. All right, so let's take a look at our practice lab that we have to do. Okay, and then I'll let you have your early Halloween celebration. So I know practice lab sometimes is laggy, okay? But this lab is not too long. This is gonna show you how to implement DNSSEC. So I'm just gonna explain the instructions so that way you kind of understand what you're gonna be doing. Then, and the good thing about practice lab is they're pretty clear about their instructions while, you know, they're lacking in some areas, but they have screenshot for you and, you know, so which is nice. So you're going to mainly work with Server 2016. I think they have released Server 2020, but a lot of companies are still using 2016 or 2018 because for that operating system, it was somewhat stable and it's, you know, changed from 2013 release. So here, when you install a DNS, okay, and make sure you disable your pop-up blocker, what you do is you can, when you install it, or that role in the server, right, to make that system a DNS server, you have to put in your primary zone for that domain. Okay, so in task 1, what it's doing is it's showing you how you can create a forward lookup zone and a reverse lookup zone. So when we say forward lookup zone, it's going to look up the domain name and tie that to the IP address. Okay, so for example, my domain is Microsoft.com. It's going to tie that to, let's say, 172. Blah, 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 right? Or an IPv6 address. This has to be configured in order for that server to understand that when the user is looking for that domain, it needs to correlate that fully qualified name to the address. Then, so it shows you the steps on how to create a new zone, okay? And with the DNS in Windows environment, it has to use Active Directory. Active Directory is another role for the server to be able to have a directory of users and group. Because what's the point of having a domain without any user? So Microsoft implemented Active Directory to allow us to manage the systems and the users and the groups and the policy correlated to those users and groups. So what this will do is we are going to set up the Active Directory zone replication, so that way once you update on one system, it needs to replicate across all the other system in that domain. So like I mentioned before, if you heard this right, when you're accessing your RCCD email as a student, you're actually accessing a child portion of our bigger domain, okay? However, when they manage it, they would manage that group of account from a higher level, and they would push it down to the child. So it needs to replicate that the rules, the configuration from the parent domain and bring it over to the subdomain, which is known as the child domain. Okay. Now, it automatically sync within the hours for replication, or we can force it to replicate. So anytime you make changes to zone, to configuration, to policy, you need to force it to update, and then you need to replicate it from one server to the other servers, okay? Because most of our network are distributed networks. And here it shows you how you can establish the dynamic update, and that would only allow you to have secure dynamic updates. Let's see. So for task 2, they are going to show you how to create a record. So basically, a records in DNS, a new host record, is a file. Okay, so earlier when we talk about DNS poison, what they do is they go in and they modify the information in that file or in the files. Okay, because we can have many records. So the record A here, all that pertains to is the host of the DNS. Okay, so you can add the host to that record. You can say this is the system that's going to host, right, that domain. So what we will, once you do that, right, that role now can be effective in that it would pinpoint that system as the host that's going to correlate with this IP address, with this domain, servicing the rest of the other systems. Okay, so this is why they have you put in the name and the IP addresses, because that would be in the host records. Okay. Now, then for task 3, you are gonna create a non-authoritative DNS. So in this here, what they have you do is you are gonna use the shell. In this type of industry, you should brush up on bash scripting and shell scripting. This is what we do all the time. So PowerShell is what Microsoft uses. You can use shell to push your script. You can use shell to configure system. So at this point, what we're doing here in step 2 of that task is to access the management tools in shell, okay? And instead of clicking and configuring, what they're showing you to do is to use PowerShell to change the configuration for that DNS. Okay. And if, you know, Windows 10, Server 2006 and forward have PowerShell built in. If you're using an older Windows like 7 or 8, you have to install it separately. And it's only supported on professional and enterprise releases. I'm a Microsoft certified individual, so I always follow up with that. And so that's why I have a lot more knowledge in Microsoft. I use Linux, but I'm not as equipped in Linux as I am in Microsoft. I know Microsoft inside out, so especially with server, because I did it for a long time. Okay. So here we're setting up forwarders. So let's say that you have one DNS and then you have another system that you wanted to use as a forwarder, right? So that way we don't have a bottleneck, right? Let's say we have thousands and millions of users. So you can set up forwarders on the DNS role, and then all you have to do is point to that address. Then it's also going to tie that address to the domain name system for that network, for that domain. Okay. Let's see. And then we can also create a secondary domain controller, right? Like I told you before, you can have subdomain, you can also have secondary domain controller. Back in the day, we used to call it primary and backup controller. They still use those terms, but now they wanted to make it secondary because it's not hierarchy in that sense. But so here it shows you how you can use the PowerShell to do that. And yes, you have to be the administrator to access at that level. So you have to, if you use command line, you have to do run as administrator, but if you use PowerShell, you have to state the account that you're using. Okay. So you need to install the role for the second system. So this is why you would use multiple virtual machine this time. Okay, multiple server virtual machine. Okay, then once you finish, you would log off and then take a screenshot for that one. After that, once we set all of that up, right, we have the record, we have the primary or the main domain controller, we have a secondary domain controller, we have the management DNS tools that we're going to use. Then what we will do is we would implement DNSSEC. So that way people don't go in and modify our records on our DNS. Okay, so here it shows you how you can do that. So it protects the integrity of those records. Okay, and here we have to do the signing option because the security portion of it, it ties back to digital signature integrity, right? So the extension of this require that part. And so you have to sign the zone. When I taught at College of the Desert, they didn't have things like this for student to use. I manually have to create a lot of the instructions and I walk them through it. So if you like Windows stuff, we do have a class that's focused on Windows system administration and going into the next one, which is system administration and also DevOps. In the security, I think it was the IT specialist one. And also some of it goes into the security specialist one. So, you know, okay. So the rest of this part, what it's doing is it's showing you how you can use the sharing feature across the domains, okay, to be able to tie in some of the trust and the certificates, trust points. Because you can create system, but if you don't build trust between those systems, they're not going to be effectively communicated. So in the hierarchy, in that environment, you can have, you know, different level of trust across the servers. So as you use you see, it uses the key, right? It comes back to, you know, implementing the security. So you would have the key and then you can use that key in the trust process. So that way the primary and the secondary can effectively communicate. Okay. And when you look at the older server operating system, it didn't have a lot of these things. They later implement some of this past 2013. So because there's a need for it, right? As we see that now there's different form of attacks. Okay. So again, more PowerShell. Now watch out for the syntax, right? Typos, making sure that we type everything correctly, like what they said. Otherwise, you're not gonna get past that point. So. I think at this point they're doing the updates. So update between the two servers. And then let's see if after that you would customize it for the unsigned zone. And then maintaining the key. So Microsoft also implement a way that we can distribute key, but for DNSSEC, you use the key master. Okay, so that allows you to sign keys. So this is a way that we can safely authenticate systems for specific keys, right? It's a feature that they implement for that. Okay, so I'm skipping forward a lot because I wanted to finish out in the next 2 minutes. So at the end, make sure that you go through the assessment questions as you complete it, right? And for the CompTIA part, pay attention to some of the explanation and the description in this step. It really explains some of the areas, what that is, what protocol, what part of the protocol that you're configuring. So just don't do it because, you know, it's there, but just trying to get more out of it. That's what I'm saying. Okay. If you have any questions or any concern, please let me know. This one, you know, requires a little bit more technical step, but I want to introduce this to you as we talked about it. Not a lot of people know how to manage DNSSEC, to be honest, even some of the administrator, right? Because they might have implemented the old OS and it didn't have that, and they haven't rolled it up to the next version, or you know, they're not familiar with the tools. So this kind of give you a little bit more. So now, as you go through a lot of these things, you can start documenting this. If you wanted to do this professionally, put it on your, you know, your resume, like knowledge of, right? We're not saying that we're expert in this, but you know how to do this now. So you can say knowledge of Windows PowerShell, configuring DNS, configuring DNSSEC, right? Because when people look at your resume for IT people, for me and many of my colleagues, we look for specific keywords that talks about that technology. So as you go through the classes, start writing down the information, right? Like in the last class, you should document, you know, about OSI layers, right? Switches and routers and knowing what they are, or knowing how to work with TCP/IP network, stuff like that. Okay. All right. Any question? Okay. So I'm going to stop for the day, right? I wish you have a good Halloween. I'll stick around for questions in case you have individual questions for me. And I wish you have a good Halloween, and I'll see you here next Saturday. It will be our 3rd week. Okay. We're halfway there. Have a wonderful afternoon, everybody. Thank you. Do you have any questions? Thank you for putting your name. Have a good afternoon. Yeah. Joseph and Jan, do you have any questions? Okay, I'm gonna get off if no questions. Have a good Halloween, okay? Take care.